The intake bay at Karathen Station Medical Annex had 17 cots, 2 functioning diagnostic panels, 1 window that stuck open in warm weather, and 1 that stuck shut year-round, and a supply cabinet whose lock had been broken so long that the maintenance request had outlasted 2 chief administrators and a station-wide audit. None of that bothered me. I had worked triage in worse places, a field tent on the Sorrel Crossing during the freight line riots, a converted cargo module on Veth Station before it was decommissioned, a single-room annex on a border way station so understaffed that I had once gone 41 hours without relief. Karathen was not ideal, but it was functional, and I had long ago made peace with the difference. My name is Peloron. I have been a triage nurse for 31 years. I am 59 years old, broad through the shoulders, slower than I used to be on the stairs, and I have never once in 3 decades of this work looked at a patient on a stretcher and decided they were not worth my time. That is not a brag. It is just the job as I understand it. You take what comes through the door. You assess, you stabilize, you document. You do not choose who arrives in need. I mention that because it matters to what happened, and I want to be clear about it before I tell the rest. It was a 4th day, which at Karathen meant the freight rotation from the outer ring had just cycled through, and the intake bay would be busy with the usual load. Pulled tendons, a crush injury if we were unlucky, chemical burns from loader fluid, the occasional fracture from a pallet drop. The mid-ring freight workers were a reliable population, and I knew most of them by name. I knew which ones would argue about pain medication and which ones would not admit to pain at all. I knew which ones had family on the station and which ones were living out of their crew quarters indefinitely, the way people do when a way station stops being a stop and becomes, quietly, the place they ended up. I was updating the supply requisition. The cabinet lock had finally been replaced that morning, and someone had helpfully reorganized everything in a way that made no sense. When I heard the stretcher's wheels in the outer corridor, the sound was wrong. Standard transit stretchers have a particular rattle. This one was slower, and there were more feet than usual, and somebody in the corridor was already talking too loud, which at Karathen Medical Annex meant we were about to have a situation. I came through the inner door as they turned the corner. The transit stretcher was a freight-rated unit, the wide flat kind used for oversized loads, not a medical stretcher at all, and on it, taking up most of its length, was a dragon. He was not small. Adult male, fully mature, somewhere between 200 and 300 years of age by the heaviness of his bone ridges and the settled depth of his coloring, deep slate-gray scales with a blue-green iridescence at the edges, the kind of color that only comes with age, like patina on worked metal. He was lying on his left side, which told me immediately that the right side was the problem, and his breathing was shallow and careful, the way a person breathes when each full breath costs something. His tail was curled partway up the stretcher frame. His claws, the front set, were half extended, not in threat, just in the involuntary way a creature extends its grip when it is in significant pain and cannot help it. He was missing his left horn entirely. Not a recent injury, the socket had long since healed over, smooth keratin scar tissue years old. His wing was folded against his body, but even folded I could see it was wrong. The membrane was contracted and fused at 3 points, pale scar tissue pulling the wing into a shape it was never meant to hold. He would not be able to open that wing fully. He could not fly. This, I understood in the first 5 seconds, was a dragon who had not been able to fly in a very long time. Behind the stretcher, there were 4 freight workers. 2 of them I recognized from the outer ring rotation, and a transit authority officer who had the expression of a man who wanted to have discharged his paperwork responsibility already and go back to his post. He said to me. Yes, I said. Found him in the freight bay, lower deck. Altercation. He consulted his pad. 3 other parties involved. 2 human freight workers, 1 Sarathi loader. All 3 declined medical. He did not decline. Declined would have been impressive, one of the freight workers said, and the other one laughed. It was not a kind laugh. Non-functional, right? That's what it says on the transit register. Non-functional. He said it the way people say a word they find satisfying. Flew in on a cargo transport. Except, didn't fly. What's his name? I said. The transit officer checked his pad. Register says Veth. No secondary designation logged. Verith bloodline, registered non-functional. No current domicile. He's a freight passenger. That's all the system has. Veth, I said. I looked at the dragon. His eyes were open, pale amber, very still. He was watching me with the careful attention of a creature who has learned to be very quiet when humans are deciding things about him. I'm Peloran, triage nurse. You're in the medical annex. We're going to get you off this freight pallet. He did not answer. His eyes stayed on me. Bay 4, I said to the freight workers. Through here. Careful on the turn. We were halfway through the inner door when Dr. Sovereign came out of the consultation room. Sovereign was Karath Sen Annex's senior physician, which at a mid-ring waystation meant he was a man who had missed the postings he'd wanted, and had never entirely forgiven the universe for it. He was competent, I will give him that. But competence and willingness are different things, and there were categories of patient Sovereign found it easy to be unwilling about. He took one look at the freight stretcher, at the dragon on it, and he stopped. What is this, he said. Not a question. Patient intake, I said. Bay 4. I'm going to need a rib plate diagnostic and a secondary panel for the wing assessment. Pell. Sovereign's voice had that particular flatness it got when he had already decided something. Check the transit register. I've seen the register. Then you've seen the classification. I've seen the name, I said. Veth. Adult male, Vareth line. Presenting with chest trauma, probable rib plate fracture, soft tissue injuries to the right lateral flank. I kept moving toward Bay 4. I'll need that diagnostic. Sojin stepped into the corridor ahead of the stretcher. Not physically blocking, he was careful about that, always, but positioning himself so that everyone in the corridor understood what he was doing. Registered non-functional. Under Karath Sen Station Medical Annex Charter, Section 14, non-functional status removes the requirement to provide standard treatment. Resources. We have 17 cots. Freight workers from the outer ring are already booked through the evening. Bay 4 has a cot, I said. It isn't booked. Pell, it isn't booked, and he is injured, and I am the triage nurse on this shift. I said it calmly, because getting loud with Sovereign never helped, and it was not how I worked anyway. I'm going to put him in Bay 4 and do an assessment. If you want to file a charter dispute with the Annex administration, I'll note the time you submitted it. Sovereign's mouth thinned. He knew, as well as I did, that the annexed administration had 3 staff members and a backlog that ran to the end of the fiscal cycle, and that any charter dispute would sit unresolved long enough to be irrelevant. He stepped back. Your shift documentation, he said. I'll handle it, I said. The freight workers got him off the pallet and onto the Bay 4 cot with less grace than I would have liked, but without dropping him, which was the main thing. They left quickly, all 4 of them. The transit officer had his pad stamp, the freight workers had a rotation to return to, and none of them were interested in the paperwork end of this. I closed the bay curtain. Veth had not made a sound through any of it. He lay on the cot. It was not quite long enough. His tail curved off the end, and watched me pull on my gloves. I'm going to start with a look at your right side, I said. Tell me if anything I do causes acute pain. His voice, when he finally used it, was low and measured. Draconic in register, there was a resonance to it that human vocal cords could not produce, a depth that you felt as much as heard. He said, You don't have to. I know, I said. The classification. The classification is a transit registry category, I said. It is not a medical instruction. Hold still. He held still. The rib plate fracture was significant, a hairline through the 3rd right plate and a partial crack in the 4th, consistent with a heavy impact. The soft tissue damage along the right flank was extensive. Deep bruising, 2 lacerations that needed cleaning and closure. Something beneath the surface that would need imaging to rule out internal bleeding. His wing I did not attempt to assess that first hour. The old scarring was not a new emergency, and the current injuries were enough. I worked methodically. I have always worked methodically. It is not a virtue, it is simply how the job gets done. Clean the lacerations. Apply closure strips. Check the diagnostic readout on the rib plate. Note the respiratory rate. Note the temperature. Note the pain indicators, as best I could read them in a species whose pain language I had to interpret, partly by observation and partly by what he said when I asked him directly. He answered questions when I asked them. He did not volunteer information. He was not hostile, nothing like hostile. There was, in fact, a sort of careful courtesy to him, the courtesy of someone who has learned that the least friction is the safest strategy. But he was not warm either, not then. He watched me work with those pale amber eyes, and he answered my questions in as few words as would satisfy them. Any pre-existing respiratory conditions besides the wing? No. When did you last eat? A pause. Yesterday. Early. Allergies to standard analgesics. Vorth compound. It causes arrhythmia. I noted it. Good to know. I'm going to use a sorrel base compound instead. It'll be slower but cleaner. You'll feel it in about 10 minutes. Another pause. He seemed to be considering something. Then, you know the sorrel compound. I worked a field annex on the Sorrel Crossing for 4 years, I said. We used it a lot for species that had Vorth sensitivities. It's a good compound, just not glamorous enough for most supply budgets. I peeled off the outer glove and checked the imaging queue. I'm going to request an internal scan. There's something in the lateral flank I don't like. It'll take about 20 minutes to get the equipment over here. We share the imaging unit with the surgical bay. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, the classification. It's not inaccurate. I'm aware, I said. I was writing up the imaging request. I read what it said. I cannot fly. I haven't been able to fly in. He stopped. A long time. I know, I said. It doesn't change my assessment of your current injuries. I heard him exhale. It was a long breath, carefully controlled, and underneath the control there was something, not quite disbelief, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a creature recalibrating. I'll be back in 20 minutes, I said. The compound should be taking effect by then. Let me know if your breathing changes. I filed the imaging request, checked in on Bay 2, where a freight worker had a mild loader fluid burn that was going to be fine, and went to the supply cabinet to pull what I would need for the secondary dressing work once the imaging came back. Sovereign was at the documentation desk, and he did not look up when I passed, which was fine with me. The imaging came back showing no internal bleeding, which was the main thing. There was some deep tissue contusion in the lateral muscle group that would take weeks to resolve, and the rib plate fracture was going to need the brace fitting, which we did have, because the annex stocked a general species kit for exactly this kind of situation, and the Varith bone plate brace was in the kit, slightly dusty but intact. I brought the brace to Bay 4. Veth was still awake. No internal bleeding, I told him. The rib plate is going to need the brace for at least 10 days. It's not comfortable, but it will stabilize the fracture and let you breathe without risking displacement. I showed it to him. I'm going to fit this now. Tell me if I need to adjust the alignment. Your anatomy will tell me better than my estimate. I know, he said. I've had a rib brace before. There was something in the way he said it. Not self-pity. It was too flat for self-pity. Too matter-of-fact. Just the plain statement of a creature who had been injured more than once and had treated his own injuries more than once, and was simply reporting a fact. Then you know it takes about 15 minutes to fit properly, I said. Yes, he said. We worked through the fitting in silence, mostly. I adjusted the lateral straps twice. He told me the left side needed 3 millimeters more clearance, and he was right, and once the adjustment was made, his next breath came easier. I noted the adjustment in the record. When the brace was set, I pulled the stool from under the supply shelf and sat down. It was by then early evening. The afternoon freight rotation patients had come and gone. The loader fluid burn, a sprained wrist, a young freight worker with a fever that turned out to be a respiratory infection starting, sent away with a course of antibiotics and instructions to drink more water. Sovereign had left at the end of his official shift. The annex was quiet. You're staying, Veth said. It was not quite a question. Night triage, I said. I'm on until 6. He looked at me. The amber eyes were steadier now. The analgesic had taken hold, and the worst of the acute pain had settled to a manageable level. I heard what the physician said about the charter. Section 14 is a transit classification rule, I said. It's not a medical ethics rule. They're different documents, different offices. I leaned back on the stool. I've been a nurse long enough to know the difference between a rule that tells me what I have to do and a rule that tells me what someone wants me to believe I have to do. Something shifted in his face. Dragons are not easy to read. The scale structure means that the small muscular movements that humans use for expression are translated into different markers, and it had taken me years of working with various draconic species to learn to read them at all. But I had worked enough years. What I saw was not warmth, not yet. It was something more careful than warmth. It was the look of a creature reassessing whether the situation was what it had expected. You worked the Sorrel Crossing, he said. 4 years, I said. Field annex. Mostly freight line workers, some military spillover, a lot of species variety. You learn to work with what shows up. The Sorrel Crossing had a significant Varath presence, he said. Freight contracts. Yes, I said. That's where I learned the Vorth compound sensitivity. Second week I was there, a Varith freight handler came in with a crush injury, and the standard analgesic protocol nearly killed him. After that I made sure I knew the alternatives. Veth was quiet for a while. The station's overnight ventilation had kicked in, the low, even hum of recycled air that was the background music of every waystation night shift I had ever worked. Somewhere in the freight ring, a loading crane was cycling. the distant mechanical thump of it traveling through the station's hull. How long have you been at Kareth Sen? He asked. 6 years, I said. Before that, the Sorrel Crossing. Before that, a border annex on the Vethkel line, 2 years. Before that, a field tent. You accumulate postings. I looked at the diagnostic readout. His respiratory rate had normalized. Are you hungry? Another recalibration. What? It's been since yesterday morning, I said. The annex doesn't stock draconic rations, as a matter of course, but the freight commissary on Mid-Ring 4 has a standing supply for transit crews. I can put in a request. He stared at me. You don't have to do that either. I know, I said. Are you hungry? A very long pause. Yes, he said. I put in the commissary request. It took 40 minutes to arrive. A freight runner came by with 2 sealed containers of the high-protein ration, packs used for large draconic transit passengers, which were not quite right for the Vareth line but were close enough, and I left him to eat while I did the overnight documentation and checked the other bays. When I came back, both containers were empty and he was asleep. I noted it in the log, resting comfortably, rib plate brace holding, respiratory rate normal, analgesic effective. I turned down the bay lights and went to do the rest of my rounds. That was the first night. The second day brought a complication I had half expected. The infection arrived in his lateral muscle group. The deep contusion from the impact had created exactly the kind of bruised tissue that invites it, and by mid-morning his temperature was rising and the injured flank was radiating heat. I could feel through my gloves. I started the antibiotic course immediately and adjusted the analgesic to allow for the fever load, and I pulled the supplemental cot blanket from the linen shelf and brought it to Bay 4. He was awake, and for the first time, visibly uncomfortable in a way he had not been before. The controlled stillness was harder to maintain against a rising fever. His eyes tracked me when I came in. Infection, I told him. The lateral tissue. I've started antibiotics. It's not unusual for this kind of injury, and we caught it early. Your temperature is going to climb before it comes down. That's normal. I'm going to monitor it. How high? He said. Depends on the individual. For Vareth line, I'd expect it to peak around 41 or 42. That's uncomfortable, but not dangerous by itself. If it goes above 43, I'll intervene more aggressively. I unfolded the blanket. In the meantime, cold compresses on the neck ridge will help, and I want you drinking fluids. He watched me set the compress. You've treated Vareth before. At the Sorrel Crossing, yes. 2 or 3 over 4 years. Not many, but enough to have a working knowledge. I checked his temperature readout. You have a distinctive neck ridge structure. Most draconic species have a flat ridge or no ridge at all. The Vareth line has the pronounced double ridge, which is one of the things that makes you identifiable from a distance. It's also the first thing a combatant hits, he said, if they know the anatomy. Yes, I said, I know. The freight deck altercation. Was this targeted? He was quiet. Veth, I said. If it was targeted, I need to know, because it changes what I document and what I recommend when you're discharged. Another pause. Then, not exactly, he said. There were 3 of them. They saw the wing, they said. He stopped. They said various things about what they thought the wing meant about my worth as a person. I told them to stop. They didn't. I wrote it in the documentation. Physical altercation initiated by 3 freight deck personnel following discriminatory verbal harassment related to patient's physical disability. 3 parties declined medical treatment. Patient presents with injuries consistent with defensive posture and initial aggression from external parties. I'm going to log it as an assault, I said. For the record. The Transit Authority already took a report, he said. They classified it as a mutual altercation. The Transit Authority is not a medical office, I said. I'm logging what the physical evidence shows. You were defending yourself. The injury pattern is consistent with that. You have no offensive impact marks. All the trauma is defensive and lateral, which means you were not the one initiating physical contact. I looked at him. It matters. For the paperwork. For the record. He held my gaze for a long moment. No one has, he started and then stopped again. No one has what? I said. Nothing, he said. Thank you. I sat with him through the fever peak, which came late that second afternoon and ran until about 2 in the morning. I kept the cold compresses rotating and the fluid intake going. He drank, when I asked him to, without argument, which I noted was a form of trust, whether he would have called it that or not. The temperature hit 41.8 and then began, slowly, to come down. Somewhere around midnight, in the low hum of the overnight annex, he said, I have been on Kareth Sen for 3 weeks. I was writing up the hourly log. I hadn't seen you come through intake before this. I I was staying in the freight transit quarters. Section 14 applies to medical treatment, but not to lodging. There's a different classification for that. A pause. I've learned to know the classifications. I imagine you have, I said. Before Kareth Sen, I was on Veth Station for 7 months. Before that, the Cortical freight loop. Before that, he exhaled, I've been on various stations, since the accident. How long ago was the accident? The ventilation hum, the distant loading crane, the soft readout of the diagnostic panel in the corner. Outside the clerestory windows, the freight ring was down to its overnight skeleton crew. The lights dimmed, the crane arms stationary for their maintenance cycle. I had done enough night shifts to know that midnight on a waystation had a particular quality. A stillness that was not actually quiet, just lower frequency, the whole vast mechanical organism of the station breathing at a different rate. 11 years, he said. I finished the line I was writing. Where were you before that? The pause this time was longer than any of the others. Home, he said, and said nothing further. I did not press it. It was not my place to press it. What I understood, in the particular way that 31 years of night shifts teaches you to understand things, was that there was an enormous amount of weight in that single word, and that he had just set a small piece of it down in a room, briefly, and that the appropriate response from me was to let that be what it was rather than interrogate it. I noted the time of the temperature peak in the log, noted the temperature reading, noted the compound dosage, and I sat with him until the readings settled and his breathing evened out again into sleep. Before I got up, I checked the brace alignment. The fever movement had shifted it slightly, and adjusted the left strap back to the setting he had specified during the fitting. In the morning, the fever had broken. I came in for my shift to find him awake, temperature normal, the lateral flank still tender but no longer radiating heat. He ate breakfast, real rations this time. I had put in a standing commissary order at the start of my shift, and the runner arrived before I had finished the overnight handover. He looked at me differently that morning. Not dramatically. I want to be clear that nothing in this story happened dramatically. That was rather the point of it. But there was something in how his eyes followed me when I came into the bay that had not been there 3 days before. Something that was the beginning of ease. Temperature normal, I said. I want to keep the antibiotic course running for another 3 days to make sure the infection doesn't reestablish. The rib plate brace stays for 10 days minimum. I'd recommend 14. The lateral tissue will take longer, but that's the nature of that kind of bruising. I checked the readout. You should be mobile by end of day. Not strenuously, but you can sit up, move through the annex. There's a small common room 2 bays down. Some of the freight workers use it in the evenings. All right, he said. Veth, I said. I want to talk to you about discharge. His stillness returned. The careful kind. Not now, I said, before he could assume the worst. I mean when you're ready to discharge, in a few days. I want to make sure you have what you need. The Section 14 classification, there are ways around it, or at least alongside it. There are annex programs for extended treatment follow-up that don't require the standard classification criteria. I've used them before. I want to look at what's available for Kareth Sen Station specifically. I paused. I'm not trying to arrange your life for you. I'm saying that if you're going to be on this station for any length of time, you should know what options exist. He looked at me for a long time. Why? He said finally. Why what? Why do any of this? He said. The physician had the charter. You could have. He stopped. No one has. The last time anyone. He stopped again, and this time I could see what was happening, which was that he was trying to fit his experience of the last 3 days into a framework his experience of the last 11 years had not prepared him for, and it was not quite fitting, and it was costing him something to try. It's the job, I said. It was the truest thing I could say. You were injured. You needed treatment. That's what I'm here for. He was quiet for a very long time after that. Then, in a voice that was careful and low, and had something rough in it that had nothing to do with his injury. You are unusual, Pel Oren. I'm the night triage nurse at a mid-ring freight station, I said. I am the least unusual thing in this annex. I stood up. I'll have the discharge options pulled by this afternoon. Get some rest. I went and pulled the discharge options, as promised, and I also pulled the Section 14 classification documentation, which I had not had cause to examine closely before, and I spent an hour reading it with the particular attention I give to documents that are being used as excuses. Section 14, as written, stated that medical annexes were not required to provide treatment resources to registered non-functional individuals in cases of non-emergency need. There were two important words in that sentence. Non-emergency. Non-functional individuals covered dragons who had been administratively stripped of flight competency status, which was a Kareth Sen Station Transit Authority classification, not a medical classification, and which had been applied. I read the Associated Transit Registry documentation to any dragon who could not demonstrate basic flight capability on transit registration. It was, in other words, a classification system designed for transit management that had been adapted by a number of annex physicians over the years into something it was never written to be. The injuries Veth had presented with were unambiguously emergent: rib plate fracture, internal contusion risk, infection. None of those fell under non-emergency need by any medical reading of the charter. Sovereign had been wrong technically, and he had known he was wrong, and he had been counting on Veth not knowing it and on me following his lead. I noted this in my documentation. I also noted it in the separate incident report I filed with the Annex administration, because I had been around long enough to know that the things you do not document do not exist. The third day passed more quietly. Veth was mobile, carefully with the brace, but mobile, and I saw him twice in the common room, sitting in the chair by the clerestory window where the morning light came through strongest. The freight workers in the other bays gave him a wide berth, which was partly wariness and partly the fact that a fully grown Vareth line male dragon in a medical brace takes up considerable space, and the common room was not large. On the third afternoon, Sovereign came back on shift, and he came to Bay 4, and he stood in the doorway with a particular expression that I recognized as a man who wants to relitigate a decision, without quite admitting that he made it. The classification dispute, he said. I filed an incident report, I said. I was adjusting the dressing on the lateral wound. The administration has it. You filed an incident report. His voice was very flat, documenting that a patient presenting with acute injury was refused treatment on grounds of a transit classification that does not constitute a medical exemption. I kept working. Yes, I filed it. Sovereign was quiet for a moment. Veth, for his part, was watching the physician with a stillness that was not entirely neutral. There was something underneath it, and I did not know exactly what, and it was not my business to ask. The annex has a resource constraint, Sovereign said. Bay 4 has been occupied by one patient for 3 days, I said. It would have been occupied by a freight worker during those 3 days regardless. The resource differential is 0. Sovereign left. I put the gauze aside and looked at Veth. He was looking at the doorway where the physician had been. Does that happen often? He said. For other patients? Not often, I said. Occasionally. I file reports when it does. I strip the outer glove. It doesn't always change anything immediately, but it exists in the record, and records matter. Yes, he said very quietly, they do. On the 4th morning I came on shift to find the station was different. I noticed it before I reached the annex. The freight deck was quieter than it should have been for a midweek morning, and there were transit authority officers in the outer ring corridor in numbers I had not seen since the last station inspection. When I got to the annex itself, the reception clerk, a young woman named Maris, who had been at Kareth Sen for about 8 months and was generally unflappable, looked at me with an expression that suggested she had been flapped. What's going on? I said. There's she checked her screen. A Vareth Dominion transit column. 6 ships. They docked in the outer ring at 0400. They've filed a station inquiry. I looked at her. A full inquiry, she said. The station administrator is in a meeting with the column commander. They've been in there since 0500. I thought about this, Maris, I said. Please make sure the Bay 4 chart is accessible from reception. And call the commissary for a double ration order for Bay 4. I want it here, before 8. I went into the annex. Veth was awake. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, the brace making that somewhat awkward, but he had managed it. And his amber eyes, when I came through the curtain, were different from any way I had seen them in 4 days. Not alarmed. Not quite. But there was a quality in them that was the draconic equivalent of a very still body of water before the weather changes. You've heard the station is different this morning, I said. The hull carries sound, he said. 6 ships is a significant vibration pattern. A pause. I know the pattern. Do you? I said. Yes. He was quiet then. My brother commands the 2nd Vareth transit column. He stopped. He has been looking for me. Since this accident. He said it the way a person says something they have been carrying for a long time and have never said aloud. I left. After the accident, I left. I didn't. He looked at his fused wing. I didn't want to be what I had become in front of them. In front of him. I sat down on the stool. And now they're here, I said. And now they're here, he said. The ventilation hum, the light through the clerestory windows, early morning light, blue, white, and clean, catching the edge of the cot rail and the dust motes in the still air of the bay. What do you want to do? I said. He looked at me. The amber eyes held something I was only beginning to be able to read. It was not a simple thing. It was layered, the way things are layered in a creature who has had 11 years to build up sediment over a wound. There was fear in it, of a specific kind. Not the fear of danger, but the fear of being seen in a particular way, the fear that the seeing will change what has been. I don't know, he said. I have been. I have spent 11 years being what the classification says I am. Something that doesn't require a bed. That's not what you are, I said. I know that, he said, and then quietly, it's different when someone else knows it. I had nothing very useful to say to that, so I didn't say anything. We sat in the bay for morning light for a little while. The ration delivery arrived. He ate. I updated the chart. They came at 8:30. I heard them before I saw them. The sound of a group moving through the annex outer corridor with the particular measured cadence of people who are accustomed to their passage meaning something, and behind that cadence the receptionist's voice doing her best to explain to someone who was clearly not interested in being explained to that the patient was in Bay 4 and was recovering from. I came through the bay curtain and into the main annex corridor as they turned the corner. There were 7 of them. 4 were Vareth line dragons, full adults, the same deep slate gray and blue-green iridescence, the double neck ridge, the bearing of creatures who serve in a military structure and have served in it for a long time. They were not in threat posture, not even close, but they had the quality of very controlled power, the kind that does not need to demonstrate itself, because it has never had reason to doubt its own weight. The morning light from the clerestory windows caught the iridescence in their scales and threw pale blue-green reflections across the annex corridor. Behind them, 2 Kareth Sen Transit Authority officers who had clearly been attached to this group, whether they wanted to be or not. And at the front, the one who had to be Orith Ven. He was taller than Veth by half a head, older, the coloring deeper, the bone ridges more pronounced, the crest along his spine carrying a weight of years that Veth's did not yet have. His left horn was intact. His wings, folded at his back, were whole. He was dressed in the transit column livery of the Varath Dominion, clean, authoritative, worn as if it meant something, because it did, and he moved through the annex corridor the way a legate general moves, without particular urgency, without aggression, but with the absolute certainty of a creature who has decided where he is going, and has not considered the possibility that anything will be between him and there. He stopped in front of me. "You are the triage nurse," he said. His voice had the same resonance as Veth's, the same draconic depth. But where Veth's voice had been quiet and careful, this voice had been shaped by command for a very long time. It was not a threatening voice. It was the voice of a creature who had spent years issuing orders that were followed and requests that were treated as orders, and who was, I noted, choosing to speak to me in the register of a request rather than a command. "Pel Oran," I said. "Yes." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not quite read. Then, "My brother is here." "Yes," I said. "Bay 4. He's been here 4 days. Rib plate fracture, infection in the lateral muscle group. The infection is resolved, the fracture is stabilizing. He needs the brace for another 10 days minimum, ideally 14. He can be moved when he's ready, but I'd recommend waiting at least." "He is alive," Orith Ven said, and I stopped. Because there was something in those 3 words that told me that whatever I thought I understood about 11 years and a search and a docking at 0400, I understood only the surface of it. There was something in those 3 words that I will not attempt to fully describe because I was not the one who had spent 11 years not knowing. He said it the way a person says a thing that they have been afraid, for a very long time, might never be true. Not a question. He could see from my face that it was true. But the saying of it aloud, the first saying after 11 years of it being unsaid, which is a different thing from a question. "He is a lalai," said. "Yes." Behind him, one of the 4 Vareth officers made a sound that was not quite words. Orith Ven closed his eyes for a moment. It was a brief thing, and he recovered from it almost immediately, and I doubt the transit authority officers noticed it. I noticed it. I noticed it the way I notice the things that happen in corridors and bays that are not medical events, but are real events. The moment when the weight of something finally lands, when the long carry of a thing is permitted, just briefly to touch the ground. "May I see him?" he said. "Yes," I said. "Bay 4 is through the inner door, second curtain on the left." I paused. I want to come in with you, briefly. Not to supervise. To introduce you to his chart and let him know you're there. He knows the column is docked. He's been expecting this. Orith Ven looked at me. The expression now was clearer than any he had shown in the corridor, and it was the expression of a creature who had been moving very fast for a very long time and had just been asked to slow down by someone who was not doing it to control him, but was doing it because it was the right way to do the thing. Yes, he said. All right. I went first. I pushed the bay curtain back and looked at Veth, who was sitting up on the cot with the brace in the morning light, and those amber eyes that were already looking toward the curtain before I had finished pushing it back. Veth, I said. Your brother is here. I stepped to the side. What happened in Bay 4 in the next few minutes is not mine to tell in detail, because it was not mine. I have been a triage nurse for 31 years, and I have been in many rooms where things happened that were larger than medicine, and I have learned to do my job in those rooms, while also understanding that my job is not the main event in them. I stood at the side of the bay, and I watched the Legate General of the 2nd Vareth Transit Column come through the curtain and stop when he saw his brother. And I watched something in Orith Ven's bearing change. Not collapse, not break, but change. The way a very rigid structure changes when it finally touches what it has been braced against. And I heard Veth say something in Draconic that I do not speak well enough to translate, low and careful and rough, in the way his voice had been rough the previous day when he had said that no one had. I let the curtain fall and I went to the documentation desk. I wrote up the 4th day chart entries: vitals, normal, rib plate fracture, stable embrace, lateral tissue, resolving well. Patient has been ambulatory since morning of day 3. Infection markers, fully resolved. Prognosis, discharge in 2 to 3 days, pending patient readiness. Continue antibiotic course through discharge date. Maris came to the documentation desk. The administrator is asking, she said quietly, whether there's anything she needs to know about the patient in Bay 4. She can read the incident report, I said. It's all there. Maris looked at me, and then looked at the curtain to Bay 4, and then looked back at me, the transit column commander. He was, she hesitated. The administrator said he was in the meeting, and she said he kept asking about a medical annex. He had the annex name specifically. He asked about a triage nurse named Pel Oran. I looked at her. How would he know my name? The transit register, she said. When a patient is logged, the attending clinical staff are in the record. Apparently, they pulled the records the moment they docked. She paused. All of them. Going back to when the patient registered on station. I thought about that. 3 weeks of transit records. My name on the intake log from 4 days ago. All right, I said. The administrator is asking what she should tell the column commander's attaché about the attending nurses. Tell her the attending nurse is at the documentation desk and will be available after he is finished in Bay 4, I said. And please make sure there are 2 chairs available in the consultation room. We're going to need somewhere to sit. When Orith Ven came out of Bay 4, the 4 Vareth officers and the Transit Authority personnel were still in the outer corridor, which had become somewhat crowded. He came alone. He came to the documentation desk. Pella ran, he said. Yes, I said. I was finishing the 4th day entry. I want to know, he said. What happened? From when he came in? I can walk you through the medical record, I said. That's all I'm able to formally provide, the clinical documentation. The rest is his to tell. I know, he said. I want the medical record, yes. But I also want, he paused. He was, I realized, a creature not entirely accustomed to asking for things that fell outside the parameters of formal request. I want to know what he was like. In there, these 4 days. I set down my pen. He was quiet, I said. He answered questions when asked. He followed medical instructions without argument, which is not as common as you'd think. He told me about the Vorth compound sensitivity. That alone probably saved his night too. He asked careful questions about his own condition and understood the answers. I paused. He ate when I asked him to. He slept when the analgesic let him. He had the bearing of someone who has been a long time in the habit of making himself small. I looked at Orith Ven. He is not small. The Legate General looked at me for a long, still moment. No, he said. He is not. The Section 14 classification, I said. I want to address that directly. It was applied by the intake physician on the shift preceding my own. It was incorrect. The presenting injuries were unambiguously emergent, and the charter's language around non-emergency provision was misread or misapplied. I filed an incident report with the Annex Administration, and I documented the medical basis for treatment in full. The record is complete. I paused. I'm telling you this not because I expect anything from it. I'm telling you because the record should be clear about what happened here, and the record should be clear about what the Section 14 classification was used to try to do. Orith Ven was very still. I have been searching for my brother for 11 years, he said. When we stopped at Karath Sen station for routine freight transit, I had no reason to believe he was here. I had no reason to believe he was anywhere in this sector. My attaché runs a standard registry cross-check on every station we dock at. It has been running for 11 years at every station. He paused. The cross-check flagged a medical intake record logged 4 days ago, with his name, in your annex, under your attendance. I know, I said. 4 days ago, he said. He had been on this station for 3 weeks before that. I know, I said. He wasn't injured before that. I can only be responsible for what comes through the intake bay. Yes, he said. That is what I want to say to you. That you are only responsible for what comes through the intake bay, and that what came through 4 days ago you treated, without being required to, against the instruction of the physician on duty. A pause. And that the record you filed, the incident report, the medical documentation, was the thing that made the cross-check flag his name correctly. A non-functional registration would have appeared in the registry, but it would have been filtered from the medical cross-check because the cross-check only queries active treatment records. Your intake log was an active treatment record. That is why it appeared. I had not thought of that. I looked at the documentation desk. The intake log from 4 days ago with his name was still up on my screen. I filed the incident report because it was the correct thing to do, I said. Yes, Orthen said. I know. That is exactly what I mean. He put something on the documentation desk. It was a small flat disk, the kind used for formal record transmission in Vareth Dominion, administrative correspondence, a closed-loop document carrier, the physical kind, which the Dominion still used for records they considered significant. I looked at it without picking it up. For the annex record, he said, it's a formal notification of error classification. The Dominion's own administrative notation regarding the Section 14 application at this station. It will go into the station's central registry and into the annex's official file. It will be seen by every medical administrator who reviews this annex's compliance record. He paused, and there is a second document on it. For you, specifically. I would like you to read it, but I won't ask you to read it now. All right, I said. Veth is asking for you, he said. He says, a pause. He says you need to update the chart. I almost smiled. The chart is up to date, I said, but tell him I'll be in shortly. Orith Ven looked at me in a way that was not entirely unlike the way his brother had looked at me when I had asked him if he was hungry and he had not known what to do with the question. Thank you, he said. Pel Oran. It's the job, I said. He went back down the corridor to rejoin his attaché, and I finished the 4th day documentation, and I picked up the disk and put it in my desk drawer. And then I went to Bay 4. Veth was still sitting on the cot. He looked different. I do not know how else to say it. He was the same dragon, same brace, same amber eyes, same scarred wing. But something in the quality of the air around him was different, the way air is different in a room after the weather has finally broken. He was not healed. He had not been fixed. What had happened was not a cure. It was something more like a door that had been closed for 11 years and had been quietly opened. Charts current, I said. I came to look at the brace and check the lateral tissue. I know, he said. There was something in his voice, not quite warmth, or rather a warmth he had trying to control. Thank you for telling him. For the documentation. He stopped. For all of it. You had a fractured rib plate and an infection, I said. I treated both. That's what happened. I pulled on my gloves. The brace looks good. I want to look at the lateral tissue while I have the light. He shifted to let me work. I examined the tissue. The bruising was resolving well. The warmth was gone. The closure strips were holding. Will you be moving to the column's medical bay? I asked. Yes, he said. Orith says their medical officer can continue the antibiotic course. He wants me aboard when the column continues the transit. A pause. I said I would, eventually. Good, I said. I'll put together a full handover package for their medical officer. Everything they'll need, the antibiotic schedule, the brace protocol, the Vorth compound notation. I peeled off the gloves. You should tell them about the Vorth compound yourself as well, not just leave it in the documentation. It's the kind of thing you want 2 mentions of. All right, he said. The clerestory light was almost midday now, coming in at a lower angle, catching the deep slate gray of his scales and the blue-green iridescence at the edges. In that light, in the plain Bay 4 of a mid-ring freight station annex, he was, I noticed it, the way I had not quite noticed it in the urgent days of the fracture and the fever. Something genuinely old and genuinely remarkable. A creature of deep bloodline, carrying the marks of his years and his injuries, sitting in a medical bay where he had been told he was not worth a bed, and where he had been, nonetheless, given one. Pel Oran, he said. Veth, I said. The word in Draconic, the Varath word for the one who keeps a place open when it should have been closed. When the practice or the logic of a thing says close it, but someone does not close it. He looked at me. I do not know if there is a human translation. But it is what you are. I did not know what to say to that, so I did not say anything. My brother has the word for you in the formal document, he said. The one on the disc. He chose it himself. He knows the words. I'll read it, I said. I finished the workup, updated the handover package, left it on the desk for Maris to transmit to the column's medical bay. I did one more round of the other bays. The freight worker whose respiratory infection was clearing well, a new intake from the morning rotation, a woman with a chemical burn that was minor and would resolve cleanly. I wrote up my end-of-shift notes. I filed the handover package. Before I left, I stopped by Bay 4 one more time. Veth was standing at the clerestory window, looking out at the freight ring below, the cranes, the loading platforms, the slow movement of transit vehicles across the dock floor. He had his weight on his good side, the brace visible under the thin annex robe, the scarred wing folded carefully at his back. The midday light caught the top of his crest and the double neck ridge and the careful, settled way he stood, which was the way of a creature that had learned to take up exactly as much space as it needed, and no more. He heard me come in and looked over his shoulder. Get some rest, I said. You'll be moving tomorrow or the next day. It'll be good for you. A full medical bay is better than this for the next 10 days. Yes, he said. He looked back out the window. It is a strange thing, to have been somewhere invisible for 3 weeks and then not invisible. Yes, I said. The station looks different, he said. From this window, it looked the same yesterday. I looked at the freight ring below. The cranes, the platforms, the ordinary movement of an ordinary waystation day. I know that feeling, I said. I went and got my coat from the staff room, and I read the document on the disc, which was formal and precise in the Varath administrative style, and contained a notation in a language I could only partially read. The draconic script for the word he had mentioned, which the legate general had rendered beneath in a transliteration and a translation, the one who keeps the door open when the logic of the place says to close it. Below it, in formal Varath notation, was a line that said the Varath Dominion's medical and transit attachés had been instructed to flag Kareth Sen Station Medical Annex as a preferred treatment location for Varath Line transit personnel, and to note in the flag, specifically, the name of the attending triage nurse. I folded the disc into my coat pocket. I went out through the annex main door and into the station corridor, which was still busier than usual from the column's docking, transit authority personnel, and column attachés, and the general busyness of 6 ships worth of logistics landing on a mid-ring way station. I walked through it the way I walked through it every other day, coat on, shift finished, the particular tiredness of a good night's work that has gone to the end of the available hours, and then gone a little past them. At the corridor junction, I stopped and looked back at the annex entrance. The lights were on inside, visible through the reception window. Maris was at the desk. The annex was doing what it always did, taking what came through the door. I turned and walked home. On 4th day of the following week, when I came on shift, Maris had a message waiting. It was from the column medical bay, transmitted via standard route, marked as a clinical follow-up in the normal manner of interdepartmental medical correspondence. The antibiotic course was complete. The rib plate was healing on schedule. The brace had been upgraded to the column's own equipment. The patient was doing well. At the bottom, below the medical officer's sign-off, in handwriting that was clearly not the medical officer's, larger and more careful, the deliberate hand of a creature unused to writing in the human script, there were 2 words, eating well. I noted it in the ongoing record and filed the message in the correspondence archive, and I went to start the morning round.